So we hope that you feel comfortable with it being recorded, and by you staying on to the program, that lets us know that you're fine with it being recorded. Wanted to let you know the benefits of registering today. Not only does it help us get those demographics to let our funders know what we're up to, it also lets you get engaged a little bit more in some forest and woodland stewardship educational opportunities by getting that newsletter and finding out about upcoming events. If you don't want to get that newsletter, please let Pam know. There's her email, pthomas@umd.edu. Send her an email that says no events, and she'll be happy to take you off that list. If you have questions, and I hope you do, because this is going to be a great presentation, if you have questions, please put it in the chat box. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see that little chat arrow, the little thinking bubble. If you could put your question in there, put it as it comes to your mind, bring it up in there, and then at the end, I will verbally ask those questions, and Jim will answer them as best he can. Speaking of Jim, James McCann is our speaker for today. He's the state zoologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Program. Since 1979, the Maryland Natural Heritage Program has been the lead state agency responsible for the protection and management of non-game, rare, threatened, and endangered species and their habitats in Maryland. Jim coordinates revisions to the state's rare, threatened, and endangered species animals. Wait, let me say that again. Jim coordinates revisions to the state's rare, threatened, and endangered animal species list. Working with other staff biologists, government agencies, and conservation organizations, he also helps conduct non-game wildlife surveys, monitoring, and research to guide state and federal listing decisions and to aid in their protection and recovery. So he works out of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, the Appalachian Laboratory out in Western Maryland. So him and I are representing different ends of the state. I'm here on the Eastern Shore, and Jim's coming to us from Western Maryland. So we want to find out a little bit more about you. We're hoping that you'll be able to answer this little survey that we have here about what region of the state are you from. Taylor's going to bring that survey up. And what county are you in? And then please look at that map to let us know what region of the state you're in. This will help us. No, I'm in the east. I'm in Talbot County. So my office is at the Y Research and Education Center. But as you can see from my background, I'm working from home these days. And then Jim is out somewhere in Allegheny or Garrett County. So we're getting a lot of, oh great. So we got some Central Maryland, some Southern Maryland. Great, Jim, I hope you're seeing that too. We got a good diversity. Welcome to people outside of Maryland. We got a nice diverse group here. So thank you for sharing that poll, and thank you all for letting us know where you're from. Great, thank you guys. We really appreciate learning a little bit more about you. So with that, Jim, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and if y'all can be patient while I stop sharing my screen and Jim brings his screen up. And I'm gonna duck out here once Jim starts to get going.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on how much coffee you've had already this morning. Thank you for the introduction, Agnes. My name is Jim McCann, and I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the Natural Heritage Program. So thanks for everyone for tuning in today. I saw from the polling that we have people from throughout Maryland, from far Western Maryland down to the Eastern Shore, and some folks outside of the state. What I would like to do today is give everyone an overview of Maryland's rare wildlife species. I'm going to focus on the animal end of things. I have some colleagues who specialize in rare plants, and maybe that's a good future topic for this webinar series. I'm going to talk about some of the causes of decline and extinction here in Maryland and elsewhere, and then talk about what are some species and habitat conservation priorities here in Maryland. And then finally, try to offer some guidelines for forest landowners on how to protect biodiversity and to keep common species common and possibly to help rare or declining species. So, Maryland has an amazing amount of diversity in terms of plants and animals, and a remarkable amount of diversity given its small size. It's the 9th smallest state in the country, squeezed between West Virginia and Hawaii. But a lot of that diversity has to do with its geological history and the resulting landforms and soils and habitats that were created in the wake of these changes over millions of years. And so if you go from Western Maryland, where we have these cool, shady, hemlock-dominated forest and mountain ridgetop forest, all the way down to the Eastern Shore, where you have barrier islands and expansive tidal marshes, these habitats are really at the root of this tremendous diversity that Maryland has. Another big factor is Maryland lies just south of the southern extent of glaciation here in Eastern North America. And so we share a lot of species that have boreal affinities and some that are near the northern end of their range. So we have a good, it's kind of like a biological crossroads. And here's just a quick overview of the level of diversity we have. You can see on the far left that there have been over 400 bird species documented in the state. Of those, about 220 have been documented as nesting, 96 mammals. If you go to the far right, we jump up to these amazing numbers. Over 2,600 moth species have been documented in Maryland, over 2,000 beetle species. A lot of that information, I just want to give a shout out to the Maryland Biodiversity Project, which is a great example of citizen science at work. They've been able to work with experts throughout Maryland and the surrounding region to really get a handle on the level of diversity in this state. And they've been really, really useful. If you've never visited their website, I encourage you to do so. It's kind of addictive. You'll probably want to come back again and again to learn about Maryland's wildlife. So why conserve biodiversity? Kind of a big question here. There's lots of reasons. Among the most important is the ecosystem services that biodiversity provides. Think about all the foods that we eat and how many of those are pollinated by insects or birds or bats. A lot of our medicines are derived from plants, at least 50%, and the majority of the most frequently used medications in this country are derived from plants. We think about their cultural and social value. Maryland has a deep hunting and fishing tradition. We have festivals that revolve around wildlife. Of course, there are the aesthetics. We just enjoy seeing wildlife, whether it's a rare plant, a beautiful showy orchid, or a fascinating butterfly. There's the continuance of evolutionary processes. And there's the idea that, well, you never know what we as humans in our society might need in the future. So it's kind of like an insurance policy to protect biodiversity. And finally, arguably, there's a moral imperative that we should try to keep the land and the ecosystems on it in a similar condition as to what our forebears had, and hopefully improve them. Some of you may be familiar with Aldo Leopold. Many think Aldo Leopold was the father of modern wildlife conservation. And I'll just point to the last sentence in this quote from his book: "To keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." And so he kind of touches on some of the factors I just listed in the previous slide. And that comes from his book, A Sand County Almanac. Aldo Leopold was a scientist and a prolific author and an avid conservationist. So I mentioned earlier, and Agnes mentioned that I work for Maryland DNR, the Natural Heritage Program. We've been around since 1979. And, a big part of what we do is we track the status of plant and animal species. And at this point, over 1,250, as well as distinct or unique natural communities. There are over 600 plant and animal species that are currently legally state listed as in need of conservation, threatened, endangered, or endangered extirpated. We have a state level law as well as a federal Endangered Species Act. And the State Endangered Species Act is modeled closely after the federal law. And our state law came into being in 1972. It was amended in 1975. Our funding comes mostly from the Chesapeake Bay and Endangered Species Fund and some other sources from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you may see that little icon on the lower right. We have the tax season coming up on us. And I just thought I'd throw in a little plug that, the donations that taxpayers here in Maryland provide go a long ways to help us monitor, inventory, and protect and restore habitats for rare, threatened, endangered species. We have about a half a dozen staff with a variety of expertises. We have botanists, herpetologists, mammalogists, ornithologists. And a lot of the information I'm presenting today really comes from the collective effort of all of our staff. It's a good group, and a lot of them have been working with us for many, many years. I just want to talk a little bit about the whole idea of rarity. It's a really important topic in conservation biology. And it really has, the rarity of a species is a really important predictor of extinction risk. And particularly it's closely related or influenced by three factors: the range of a species, its population size, and lastly, its habitat specificity. Our program staff take those factors into account when considering the status of a species in Maryland. And you can see here, just under the factor category of rarity, there are a number of sub-factors: range, extent, area of occupancy, population size, number of populations, and so on and so forth. Population trends, the threats to a particular species, the scope, the severity, the immediacy, all of these factors are considered when we try to assign a status to a plant or animal species here in Maryland. Each plant and animal species, every single mammal, every single bird, all of our vascular plants, all of our butterflies, and so on and so forth, are assigned a state rank. An S1 would indicate a species that is highly rare. These are among the rarest species in the state. Jumping down to an S3 is a watch list species. It could be uncommon in Maryland. It could have a relatively small range. It's on the watch list. We're keeping an eye on it. It may need more conservation attention. And finally, you get down to ranks like SH, which indicates a species that is historically known to occur in the state and still may be here. But an SX is a pretty determinative rank, and it means that a species is gone from this state. And then on the far right, you see the different state legal statuses. A little bit different from the federal statute. The federal ESA, the Endangered Species Act, is limited to just the endangered and threatened statuses. But here in Maryland, it's parsed out a little bit more, and you see a couple other statuses. So, what's useful, really useful about this information is that every state in the country, every province in Canada, every country in Latin America has a natural heritage program. And the data they collect and the statuses they assign to species in their inside their respective political boundaries are shared with an organization called NatureServe, and kind of refer to NatureServe as the mothership. And the information is really useful if you're trying to look at the range-wide status of a species. And you can see this small marsh-dwelling species, the black rail, in the upper left. Recently, this species was proposed for federal listing. And a lot of the information that was used to assess the species status came from NatureServe and the collective information that all of these programs across the country, in this case, contributed. And you can see in this graphic, all of the states that are shaded in red are states where this species is critically imperiled. It has a state rank of S1. You could also look at taxonomic groups at a larger scale. So you may notice that there's a theme here. If you look at the top 5 species groups here, well, let me back up. So what this represents is the percentage of species within each one of these species groups that are extinct or imperiled. And you can see that the top 5 groups are all freshwater aquatic species. So at the very top, freshwater mussels, and there are about 300 species in the United States. Over 2/3 of those species are extinct or imperiled. Crayfish, over half are extinct or imperiled. And this information was all gleaned from data that NatureServe compiles. If you jump down to the bottom, you'll see birds. 14% of birds in the United States are rare, declining, or extinct. That's still a significant percentage, but some of these lesser known groups you can see need more attention. And the publication that included this graphic was pivotal in persuading conservation efforts across the country to focus more on freshwater habitats. Here in Maryland, we're taking a look at the percentage of different animal groups that are globally rare and state rare. So on the far right, you can see mammals. About 20% of our species here in Maryland, and there are about 96 species, about 20% of those are state rare, and about 7 or 8% are globally rare. Now, if you go all the way to the left, you can see cave inverts or cave invertebrates. There we have an amazing percentage of highly rare species, many of which are only found in Maryland. And they include things like crustaceans, blind crustaceans that occur in cave environments. In some cases, there may be a species that is only found in a single cave in the world, and that cave is here in Maryland. Here's an example of citizen science at work. Some of you may be familiar with the Breeding Bird Atlas. Maryland DNR works with Maryland Ornithological Society and other organizations every 10 to 15 years to do a statewide breeding bird atlas. And here, this is the number of rare, threatened, endangered bird species by habitat and physiographic region. So if you look in the upper left-hand part of this graphic, you see 22 species, 22 forest nesting species occur in the Allegheny Plateau, which is far western Maryland. Whereas you might only, in the Piedmont and the upper coastal plain, you have a relatively small number of species that are occurring in that physiographic region. This kind of information helps a state agency like DNR focus its conservation efforts. And so, for example, cerulean warbler is a high priority breeding bird species in Maryland, and so is golden winged warbler. And it helps us influence ecosystem protection issues. It helps guide our land acquisition, conservation easements, habitat restoration, and the types of monitoring and research that we do. So you might wonder, why are there rare, threatened, endangered species? And there are a number of reasons. Some species are historically or naturally rare. Some species are rare within their political boundaries. So we have quite a few examples here in Maryland of species that are at or near the southern end of their range, or at or near the northern end of their range. Again, Maryland's kind of like this biological crossroads for a lot of different plant animals. But really the main cause of today's biodiversity loss is us, what we do, how we change the environment, how we alter it from its natural condition. And really the leading cause of declines is habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. I'll talk about that word fragmentation here in a little bit. Invasive species, a familiar topic. You know, in the beginning of my career, invasive species were just starting to become an issue of concern in conservation biology. And nowadays, it's on everyone's minds when we're thinking about conservation. Think about zebra mussels, gypsy moths, rock snot, if you've heard of that. If you're a fly fisherman, you're probably familiar with that. Climate change, a growing issue. The loss of natural disturbance regimes. Much of our forest land in the state was historically burned now and then, in some parts of the state more frequently than others. There are some forested habitats, for example, on the eastern shore, that are thought to have had fire regimes where we had periodic fires every 5 to 20 years. And a lot of those were set by indigenous people here in Maryland. Another big factor is pollution and toxins. Disease, what's a big issue nowadays is the impacts of disease on our bat populations, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And finally, illegal collecting and overexploitation. This is kind of a sad story here. There's a growing concern about many of our plants and animals that are over-collected and exploited. Examples include rare orchids, plant species like ginseng, and animals like turtles. So here in Maryland, how many species have we lost? And this is a very conservative estimate. At least 111 plant species and at least 23 animal species. This loss of wildlife diversity really went through two phases. And the first one is an historical loss of biodiversity that began with European settlement and extended through the Industrial Revolution up into the early 1900s. There's a lot of clearing of old forest, pristine, primeval forest. There was a lot of market hunting. You see these two gentlemen in the lower right, they're holding what were called punt guns. These were really small cannons, and they were mounted on the bows of small, shallow drafted boats. And those boats were carefully sculled to get within range of flocks of ducks and geese, and in some cases shorebirds in the tidal areas of the Chesapeake Bay. And they could take out many dozens or even hundreds of birds in one shot. I'd like to see that man on the left hold one of those punt guns. I can't imagine the recoil. Now, here are some species that we have lost: the Carolina parakeet, the heath hen, the passenger pigeon, and gray wolf. And of course, the first three I mentioned are gone. They're extinct. They're not only extirpated here in Maryland, but they're extinct here. In Western Maryland, we lost quite a few species, mostly due to logging near the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s. We lost a lot of forest that was dominated by red spruce, hemlock, and white pine. And these conifer forests are really important for species like Swainson's thrush on the upper right, Virginia northern flying squirrel, and snowshoe hare. We don't have any confirmed records of Virginia northern flying squirrel, but they occur just miles across the border in West Virginia, and it's likely that they did occur here in Maryland. If we jump down to the eastern shore, historically we had red-cockaded woodpeckers. The last known breeding occurrences of red-cockaded woodpeckers were in Dorchester County in the 1970s. Those are the last confirmed breeding records. Hessel's hair streak, this small butterfly that the caterpillar life stage requires Atlantic white cedar trees. And the Eastern Shore used to have lots of white cedar. Much of it was lost, again, during these earlier periods of logging. And in some cases because of highly frequent forest fires. So in total, there are 168 species that are officially state listed, 168 animal species. And here's just the distribution taxonomically. You can see that by far, the greatest number of state listed animals are invertebrates. And these include rare beetles, rare butterflies, rare dragonflies and damselflies, cave inhabiting crustaceans that I mentioned earlier. But it also includes quite a few mammals, 32 birds, 11 reptiles, 8 amphibians, and 19 fish. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of walk you through some of the rare species here in Maryland. And we're going to start in the far western part of the state and work our way eastward. So out here in Garrett County, which is where I reside, we have this small mammal called the southern rock vole. And it's only known from a handful of old mesic-rich forested habitats out here in Garrett County on the Allegheny Plateau. This species requires not only old forest, but areas that have rock scree with springs trickling underneath those boulder fields in the old forest. So very, very specific. It does occur to the south in West Virginia, where it's also rare, as well as to the north in Pennsylvania. Here's two interesting aquatic species. The stone cat on the left only occurs in a single river in the entire state. That river is the Castleman River out here in Western Maryland. And then the hellbender, which is the largest salamander in the United States. It also occurs in Western Maryland. And again, at only just 2 river systems in the state. It used to occur over a wider range, including the Susquehanna, but there are no recent records of this large salamander today in that part of the state. Both are very sensitive to stream habitat degradation, especially excessive levels of ammonia, high nutrients, and sedimentation. This is a cool little mammal. This is the Allegheny wood rat. It's a state endangered species. This animal has undergone a tremendous decline. Primarily, it's thought to a disease that's caused by a roundworm that's distributed by raccoons. Raccoons, when they defecate, will leave this parasitic worm in the feces. And wood rats, which are otherwise known as pack rats, like to collect things and cache them in middens. And they will come in contact with the raccoon feces. And the raccoon roundworm infects the wood rat, and it destroys it interacts with the nervous system, and it is thought to be almost always fatal. And it occurs in rock outcroppings in Western Maryland. It used to occur as far east as the Great Falls area along the Potomac River. But we've lost a significant percentage of the populations that occurred here historically. I mentioned freshwater mussels earlier, and I mentioned that about 2/3 of the country's 300 species are extinct or declining and endangered. We have 16 freshwater mussel species here in Maryland, and the majority of those are also rare, threatened, endangered. The species shown here is green floater, and it only occurs, the only remaining populations we have are in a few streams in Western Maryland. And you're looking here at Sidling Hill Creek, one of my favorite streams in Maryland. Just a remarkably pristine stream habitat that supports a lot of rare, threatened, endangered plants and animals. And among them is the green floater. Another rare species occurring in Western Maryland is the northern Barron's tiger beetle. This is an apex predator in the insect world, and it depends on these fire-dependent dry oak woodland habitats that occur usually on south-facing ridgetops here in Western Maryland. And one of the biggest causes of its decline is the loss of fire. Unfortunately, the Smokey the Bear campaign from many decades ago was amazingly successful, but we're now trying to bring fire back into these forested ecosystems to not only benefit this particular insect species, but a variety of other plant animals that are dependent on fire. Some of you may be familiar with a habitat called shale barrens, and these are really dry, unique habitats that are only found in the central Appalachians. They typically occur on really droughty soils on south-facing ridges. And the species you see here is the Olympia marble. The caterpillar is dependent on rock cress and a few other species, closely related species. And for the most part, it's restricted to this rare habitat called a shale barren. Now we're heading into the central part of the state. For those of you who live in Harford County, Baltimore County, Cecil County, Carroll County, this is arguably one of the rarest amphibians or reptiles we have in the state. The bog turtle is a state and federally listed species, and it is very picky about where it occurs. It is restricted for the most part to these small groundwater-fed emergent wetlands that occur in the northern Piedmont of Maryland. Habitat loss has been a big factor in the decline of this species, but illegal collecting is another important factor. And this is an example of a species where state agencies and federal agencies are very protective about occurrence or locality data for this species. We're simply afraid that it'll get in the wrong hands of people who will collect them, and they are sold at a very high price, mostly in the Asian market, for people to place them in their bonsai gardens. On the eastern shore is this beautiful frog, the barking tree frog, a state endangered frog, and is only found in a special habitat called Delmarva or Carolina Bays. These are seasonal wetlands that have emergent openings surrounded by a rim of shrub or forested areas. Very, very specific habitats. And then down on the lower eastern shore, along the Pocomoke River, is one of Maryland's rarest nesting birds, and that's the Swainson's warbler. Swainson's warbler is thought to be a very highly area-sensitive breeding bird species, which means it will only breed, or at least successfully, in very large contiguous forest tracts with minimal fragmentation. Unfortunately, the Potomac River corridor, with these vast areas of floodplain forest dominated by bald cypress, black gum, Atlantic white cedar, still has some habitat that's used by Swainson's warbler. And frosted elfin, a small butterfly. It's another example of a species that is dependent on habitats that are periodically burned. And in the absence of fire, they will no longer be able to persist. In this case, the frosted elfin, one of the two primary host plants that it uses is wild lupin. And wild lupin also happens to be a threatened plant species. So both the host plant and the butterfly are not doing well. But we've been doing a lot of work on the lower eastern shore to try to restore these habitats, and we're hoping that populations will recover in time. I mentioned the black rail earlier. This very small marsh species is dependent on tidal and fresh tidal marshes, and possibly, and this is a new revelation for us, possibly in some inland freshwater marshes as well. This used to be, if you're a birder, Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay region used to be the go-to place if you wanted to see or hear a black rail. And we're kind of in the center of their range along the Atlantic coast. And even here in Maryland, they've been suffering declines. And the most likely culprit, and there are probably a variety of factors, but the most likely culprit is probably sea level rise and the loss of appropriate marsh habitat. It's very sensitive to water levels. It likes to keep its feet wet, but it doesn't like to be swimming. It has to be just right. And really, it's the upper marsh habitats that are critical to this species. I mentioned sea level rise. We're looking at Dorchester County here. Sea level projections for this county are pretty grim, likewise for other counties around the bay. We're going to lose a lot of forest here. And I heard Agnes mention Matt Whitbeck is going to be giving a talk on ghost forest. And I won't steal his thunder, but if you're interested in sea level rise and learning more about how it's affecting Maryland, Matt was going to, I'm sure, give a great talk. So our bat populations have undergone just a tremendous decline. It's probably the greatest wildlife crisis in my career. And we're losing bats. We're losing cave bats. We have 10 bat species here in Maryland, and 6 of those are cave bats, the other are tree roosting bats. And it's the cave bats that are really getting hit hard by an introduced fungus, Pseudogymnoastis destructans. It's thought that this fungus came from Europe. It was introduced by cavers. They may have had spores or hyphae on their equipment, their gear, and they introduced it to caves here in North America. And the fungus interrupts the torpor of hibernating bats. It also causes physical damage, especially to their wing structure, and it has a high mortality rate. So we're losing a lot of bats here in Maryland, but we're also losing the ecosystem services that they provide. It's been estimated that the loss of bat population at this point have resulted in a minimum of $20 billion in cost to agriculture across the country. And these are the species range-wide that have been affected. And all but the gray bat do occur in Maryland, or at least have been documented in Maryland. You can see 4 of these 7 species are either state or federally listed. And it's quite possible that little brown and tricolor bats will be considered for listing as well in the future, at least at the state level. Big brown bat, if there's any hope among these cave inhabiting bats, brown bat seems to be a little more persistent. I want to jump back to this graphic that I showed earlier. You can see I've highlighted the bar for moths. And again, over 2,600 species known from Maryland. And that number is likely to grow as we learn more about this relatively little understood group of animals. And just thinking about moths, it makes me think that really, insect biodiversity is simply not an option. And moths are a good example. Plant-eating insects can only eat plants with which they've co-evolved. So that raises a lot of issues about the impacts that invasive plants are having on our ecosystems here in Maryland. 90% of all plant-eating insects can only feed on plants from 3 or fewer plant families, so they're really specific. Native plants support a far greater number of insects than non-native plants. For example, oaks in the Middle Atlantic region support over 500 different moth species. And so when you have greater native plant diversity, that means we have greater native insect diversity. And that means we have more abundant, diverse, reliable food sources for those animals that eat insects. And that includes birds and bats. And that means we have greater biodiversity overall, and we benefit from the ecosystem services that they provide. So I want to shift gears now and talk about what are some things that forest landowners can do here in Maryland. Probably the most important thing a landowner can do to help protect, conserve biodiversity here in the state is to keep your forest land in forest. Don't contribute to sprawl. It's one of the most important factors that have led to the decline of so many plant and animals and habitats here in Maryland. It's just this urban sprawl. And also try to minimize fragmentation. So what is fragmentation? Fragmentation is the whittling away of an otherwise contiguous habitat into increasingly smaller and more isolated blocks. And the term fragmentation can be applied to any habitat. It could be a grassland, a salt marsh, or in this case, a forest. But a fragmented habitat generally supports less biodiversity, and a lot of species are dependent on large contiguous habitat tracts. In this case, again, forest. With forest fragmentation comes edge effects. And edge effects really refer to what are the effects of having an edge on the species that occur within that adjacent habitat. In the case of a forest, it usually means that we lose native plant diversity the closer we are to a forest edge. There's more invasive plant species the closer we approach an edge. Edge-dominated habitats support lower forest bird numbers and lower reproduction, fewer insect pollinators, and generally a lower diversity of other wildlife groups such as salamanders and land snails. And some species simply avoid occurring near edges. If you're a forest landowner, here are some things that would be beneficial to protecting species of concern here in Maryland. If possible, forego timber harvesting in or near certain habitats. And that includes old forest, old growth forest. It also includes rich mesic forest. Rich mesic forest are forests that are really particularly vulnerable to invasion by non-native plants. And it's very difficult to control invasive plants once they get a good toehold. And logging that level of disturbance along with the road networks and the skid trails that are associated with it often provide pathways for invasive plants. Try to avoid timber harvesting in forested wetlands, including the floodplain. And then there are unique habitats, which I'll talk a little bit later. Try to minimize forest fragmentation. Don't create permanent forest openings or roads. Those represent fragmentation as well. If you're going to maintain roads or if you're going to have roads, try to minimize the number of them, their length, their width. Go with the light touch. Try to maintain canopy closure over the roads and try to maintain at least a 300-foot no-cut riparian buffer. If you don't have old forest on your property, and most landowners in Maryland don't, we have very few remaining areas of really old or true old growth forest. Try to reserve some parts of your forest for future old growth. Try to favor uneven age management and longer rotations, and specifically the silvicultural methods that involve single tree and small group selection versus even age management, such as clear cutting. Try to control invasive species and try to reduce deer densities on your land. Focusing more on streams and riparian habitats, maintain and restore forested riparian floodplains and buffers. Try to have a no disturbance buffer of at least 300 feet. And this is important. Keep livestock out and keep ATVs out. They lead to soil erosion, bank destabilization. A lot of nutrients will be coming in if you have livestock regularly using the floodplain. You may have unique habitats on your property. You may have, for example, rock outcrops, cliffs, or rock talus slopes like you see here in the photographs. And these can be important habitats for species like the wood rat, as well as timber rattlesnakes. So try to leave a buffer around these habitats. You may have a shale barren or seepage wetlands, or a fen wet sedge meadow, which is the required habitat of bog turtles. All of these habitats support unique, rare, declining, in some cases, state and federally listed species. On the eastern shore, we have Delmarva bays. I mentioned those earlier. And vernal pools are also a type of seasonal wetland closely related to Carolina and Delmarva bays. Vernal pools occur statewide, and these provide critical breeding habitat for a number of different amphibians, different salamanders, different frog species. And you can see some of those there shown on the bottom: tiger salamander, marbled salamander, barking tree frog, carpenter frog, spotted salamanders. All of these species will only breed in vernal pools in these special seasonal wetlands that are fish-free and have a natural hydro period that allows the eggs to hatch and develop into larvae and eventually into adults that leave the habitat and spend the rest of their lives in the surrounding forest. Here's a typical Delmarva Bay. Their water levels typically max out over the winter, and then they slowly recede, in some cases dry out completely by the end of the growing season in late summer. And again, these are seasonally flooded, non-tidal wetlands, and importantly, they have an absence of fish, which are predatory on the eggs and juvenile amphibians. So obligate vernal pool breeding amphibians not only need the vernal pools themselves to breed in, but they need suitable forest conditions in the surrounding landscape. That's where they spend most of their life. Spotted salamanders, for example, may only breed every 2 to 3 years, and it may take a few years before they reach sexual maturity and are able to breed. So it's important to maintain the forested conditions around those vernal pools and to minimize disturbance. What we typically strive for is to maintain a 100-foot no-cut buffer around the perimeter of vernal pools. And then what we refer to as a zone 2, which will include the wetland plus a 500-foot buffer, is within that buffer to retain pole size or larger trees, generally 10 inches DBH or larger. Try to favor longer rotations within that zone 2, maintaining a minimal basal area of 70 square feet, and strive for a hardwood dominated forest, which tend to be more favorable for these amphibian species. And also try to maintain some connectivity between vernal pools. If you have multiple vernal pools on your property, try to have an uncut or lightly cut forested corridor at all times that connect these wetlands. Well, you know, the focus of my talk today is forest and forest landowners and some guidelines that you can apply on your property, but some of you may have grasslands, and grasslands can provide important habitat for a lot of species of concern. Most of our grasslands are in an agricultural setting, but we also have native or natural grasslands. And these include serpentine grasslands in central Maryland, limestone glades in the Ridge and Valley in Washington County, for example, and oak savannas in some parts of the state. All these are fire dependent, but they also support a variety of bird species that are dependent on these large open habitats, as well as they provide great habitat for pollinators such as bees. Grassland birds are a suite of bird species that are area sensitive in that they require large contiguous tracts of grassland. There are 15 bird species that occur here in Maryland that are obligate grassland breeders. They need a minimum of 10 acres. Some species, like Henslow sparrow and upland sandpiper, require hundreds of acres. And just like in forested habitats, habitat shape is important. Grasslands that have a minimal edge, that have less convoluted perimeters, that are more closely approximating circles or squares in shape, provide more habitat for these nesting birds. If you do have these habitats on your property, it's important to avoid mowing or doing any prescribed burns during the nesting season, which is at least May through July, ideally April through August. You may want to rotate areas for mowing and prescribed burns to provide a variety of different grass heights and grassland conditions. Some species like Savannah sparrow use relatively short grass heights for breeding, whereas other species like bobolink seem to favor the taller grass and moister grass settings. And then try to maintain soft edges around the field borders, which will provide habitat for a lot of other species that seem to thrive in edge conditions. Early successional habitat. We have lots of early successional habitat in Maryland. Most of it is man-made in the form of clear cutting. You may have a succeeding old field, but we also have habitats that naturally have, in terms of vegetative structure, what I refer to as perennial early successional habitat. That could be a beaver impounded stream area where you have openings and edges that are created. It could be a wetland that has a natural ecotone that grades from the surrounding forest into a shrub zone and then into an open emergent wetland condition. If you have these types of conditions on your property, try to allow natural succession to occur in the existing fields, particularly if it's a small field. If it's a larger field, you may want to favor grassland breeding birds and other grassland species, like I mentioned earlier. But if it's a smaller field, say 5 acres or an acre, try to let it succeed. And you may want to periodically manage it to keep it in that succeeding condition. If you have a stream corridor or a river running through your property, you can let beavers do the work. You need to be patient, but they may make their way to your property. And beavers create habitat for some plant animal species that really tend to thrive in these beaver-created conditions. Create soft edges and avoid the hard edges. Again, a soft edge would be that gradual gradient of a mature forest into a younger forest, into a shrubby condition, and then finally maybe an old field setting along a forest edge. A hard edge would be an abrupt change from a mature forest to a field, and those tend to support less biodiversity. Consider prescribed burns. More and more folks are getting on board about periodic burns. And they are beneficial for a variety of species, including game species like northern bobwhite, wild turkey, and ruffed grouse. Timber harvesting. Try to minimize the fragmentation, focus near existing edges, retain some canopy trees, snags, and slash in the harvest area, and control invasive plants. There are also things you can do really at the backyard scale. You look out your kitchen window into the backyard, what do you have? If you have a lot of mowed grass, well, I think the only thing worse than having a lot of mowed grass would be pavement. There's very little biodiversity in these, anthropogenic settings. The more you can minimize the amount of mowed grass in your yard or on your property, the better. And you can focus on creating a lot of vegetative structure, either by planting or encouraging native shrubs, small trees like dogwoods or redbud, as well as native older trees. And here's an example, very pollinator friendly, lots of native plants, a lot of different structure, large shrubs, small shrubs, older trees surrounding the yard. And there's certainly lots that could be done by building it. You could create birdhouses. There are special boxes you can create that will be used by pollinating bees. Of course, nest boxes for bats and birds. Brush piles provide good habitat, not just for bunnies, but for some reptiles. Provide milkweed, a great and critical plant for the monarch butterfly. And lastly, protect your land in perpetuity. Come right back to the beginning here. This is really the most important thing you can do. At this point, I'll be happy to take any questions. Agnes, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. That was great. So fascinating. And, we could probably listen for another hour on this because seems like there's just a lot to cover. So I appreciate you taking the time with us today. So I noticed that it's a little after 1. It's 1 minute after 1. So we're going to move forward with the questions. It's nice to see that Jim's contact information is there if you want it. Jim, Where is that picture?
That picture was taken along 15 Mile Creek, which is in Allegheny County, and specifically in Green Ridge State Forest. It's one of the most pristine, least disturbed streams remaining in Maryland. And my two boys there, when they were a lot younger, and my dog, that's them, we're just out exploring, having a good old time on a hot summer day.
Oh, that's nice to share. That's nice to share. So it's a little after 1. Don't forget, next month, we're going to have Carrie Wickstead. She's going to talk about snakes. So interesting. It's going to be an interesting topic. So we're going to move forward with the questions. It started at the beginning here. If you remember, you gave a number about 168 are gone or endangered. And I think the number became 168 were endangered.
There are currently 168 animal species that are state listed as in need of conservation, threatened, endangered, or endangered extirpated. That number is likely to change soon, maybe in weeks or in the next few months. We just got approval to make some legal status changes through our state legislature. And so hopefully we'll be publishing a new list for both rare, threatened, endangered plants and animals. But right now the number stands at 168.
All right, that's interesting information to know, Jim. Hey, if you want to update our audience here, maybe we can do an article for the Branching Out newsletter or something like that to let people know. I'm sure people got really curious about what you're doing there. Interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so is all of Southern Maryland in the lower coastal plain?
Southern Maryland, and I'm thinking of Charles County, St. Mary's, Calvert, Anne Arundel. Am I missing anything?
Prince George's, maybe?
Yeah, Prince George's. Yeah, we typically refer to that as Southern Maryland, and that's part of the upper coastal plain. The lower coastal plain would include all of the counties on the Delmarva. So from Cecil County, or southern Cecil County, I should say, southward all the way down to Wycomico and Worcester, Dorchester, Somerset counties.
I see what you're saying. So Cecil, Kent, Queen Anne's, Caroline, Talbot, Dorchester, Wycomico, Somerset. So that would be considered the lower coastal plain. And then Southern Maryland would be considered which?
PG, Anne Arundel, Charles, St. Mary's, Calvert.
Okay, and that's not coastal plain.
It's the coastal plain, but it's typically referred to as the upper coastal plain. There's a lot more topographic relief in that region than on the eastern shore. Great.
So that was Sidling Hill Creek you mentioned earlier, not Exciting Hill Creek, was it?
It can be exciting to visit Sidling Hill Creek. No, it's called Sidling Hill Creek, and Sidling Hill Creek is in Western Maryland, and it flows southward out of Pennsylvania, and it forms the border of Allegheny and Washington counties.
So right when I hear Sidling Hill, I think of my travels to Western Maryland, and you know that pit stop there at Sidling Hill where they blasted the hill. So am I in the same general area? If I'm picturing that, am I picturing the same kind of area?
Yep. If you're after you've made your pit stop, if you get back in your car and you continue westward, you'll descend down from Sidling Hill, the ridge line, and you'll cross over a bridge. And that first bridge is right below you is Sidling Hill Creek. Great,
great. So our next question, I thought this one was very interesting, and interesting points. I'm going to read the whole comment with the question. Do we have an accurate baseline for the wildlife that was here pre-European contact? I sometimes think that we have now. I sometimes think what we have now is just a subset of the Eden that was here, and each generation's baseline shrinks. So we never really feel the enormity of our loss. as none alive has ever experienced it.
That's a really interesting observation. And I agree with it in the sense that we don't have the baseline that, we would like to have as scientists trying to monitor and better determine what we have lost. For example, I don't think anyone was doing much work with moths in the 1700s. So it's hard to say what we lost. And most of what we are confident that we lost is based on historical records and museum records. We used to, for example, have bison in Maryland. We used to have elk. There are even places named after those species. Buffalo Run, for example, or Elk Neck State Forest. We knew we had heath hens on the lower eastern shore, but we know relatively little about, say, butterflies that occurred pre-1900. But we do know a fair amount about what the habitat conditions were like, what ecosystems were here, and how they functioned. What were some driving factors that maintains the serpentine barren, for example, which is a rare habitat in central Maryland. And in that case, fire was critical. Without fire, that habitat would perish over time. It would take decades, but eventually it would perish.
Well, as you're talking, it's making me think of the value of that Maryland Biodiversity Project that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. That
Yep.
how valuable something like that is, and program like apps like iNaturalist and reporting some of the sightings of these things.
Yep. Yeah, and Maryland Biodiversity really, they do a great job of documenting life here in Maryland, and much of it is overlooked. Some invertebrate groups that the average person may not spend much time or be aware of. For example, spiders, and these are groups of species that, with our limited staff and budget and time, we haven't been able to spend much time on, but it does help us or bring more confidence to some of the things that we as a conservation agency do focus on. It's been really helpful.
Great. So if you want help with that Maryland Biodiversity Project or iNaturalist, I think they're pretty user friendly, those programs, if you want to help contribute to some of that information there.
Yep.
So a question here, how much of Maryland has fire dependent ecosystems? I love this question.
That is a good question, and I don't have an answer. I think most of Maryland's forest historically were probably burned periodically. Forest, say, hemlock dominated forest in Garrett County probably had a low fire frequency. I can't give you an exact number, but probably a fire interval that maybe exceeds 80 to 100 years. But if you're on, a dry oak pine dominated woodland on, say, the lower eastern shore, say in Somerset County, it's thought that those types of forest conditions historically had fires on a much more higher frequency, perhaps 5 to 10 years. Yeah. And these weren't fires that were, like the devastating fires that we're seeing out west. And those devastating fires are really a result of many decades of fire suppression. But the fires historically were probably lower level burns that resulted in relatively little or maybe no canopy openings, in terms of the loss of canopy trees, but rather it was a clearing of the understory, the ground vegetation, and exposing mineral soil.
Right. Okay, moving on to bats. So are any of the state bats pollinators? Do any of the state bats species pollinate?
No, our 10 species are all insectivorous.
Insectivorous. All these new words I'm learning today. I love it. Okay, we got a comment with a question here. With regards to introduced fungus on caving equipment, I know that both New Zealand and Australia are very strict on making sure equipment is sterilized before it's allowed in their countries. Even hiking boots will be taken at airports and sterilized. Do we do something similar?
Not that I'm aware of. We have other staff though who have a lot of expertise in bats and bat conservation issues. I think the approach here in North America has been to restrict access to caves that have been important for bat populations, to try to limit the impacts from this introduced fungus.
Okay. Along the same line, somebody has a comment. When traveling in Europe, we had to clean boots at airports and heads of hiking trails. I don't know why it's not done for folks coming or returning to the US. So people
It's a good comment.
they're wanting to see that to take care of our biodiversity here in Maryland. So question here, and it got answered a little bit. So define a forest landowner, how many acres? And Michaela, one of our Master Gardener coordinators, she answered that by saying a forest is defined as an area at least 1 acre that has a minimum of 10% tree cover. Any thoughts on that? That's from the U.S. Forest Service.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure how to respond to that. I think, any landowner, whether you have a 1/4 acre lot or you are a land baron with thousands of acres, there's always a positive role that you can play in terms of conservation. For example, for that landowner that only has a 1/4 acre, you may only have 1 or 2 trees on your property, but there's other things you could do. You could plant native plant species that are beneficial to pollinators, butterflies, bees, for example. You could put up nest boxes for nesting birds and bats. So there's always things you can do. You could conserve water, use rain barrels. So yeah, I'm sure there's many other things that aren't coming to mind right now.
Lots of strategies, and whatever works for that landowner is the one that hopefully they latch on to.
Yeah.
Good question here. And, I think this question alone could be an hour-long discussion. What is true old growth?
Yeah, you could spend hours on this one. You could have a conference or symposium on it.
Yeah.
We've struggled with the definition, in part because we have so little old growth left in Maryland to use as a reference. Maryland DNR has arrived at a definition of old growth. And I don't have it near me or in front of me, but generally it's based on the average maximum lifespan of the tree species that were native to a particular forest community. So for example, live out here in Garrett County. I'll take a hemlock dominated forest. Hemlocks are long-lived trees. And I don't recall what the maximum age is for those trees, but a forest that is dominated by hemlock trees that are at least half the maximum age is considered old growth. Now, how big of a forest tract does it have to be? And we've also here in DNR have come up with an acreage minimum. And I can't remember if it's 5 acres or 10 acres. But those are some of the things. Also, does it have old growth characteristics such as pit mound topography? And we could spend 20 minutes talking about what pit mound topography is. Is there a lack of coppice growth? That's important. The presence of coppice growth is likely an indication of past logging. So it would cast doubt on whether or not a particular forest really is old growth forest.
Defining coppice for us, please.
Coppice growth is if, let's say you go in and you have a forest that has tulip poplar in it and you cut the tree down, the natural response of the tulip poplar tree is to send out root suckers or sprouts from the tree stump. And eventually, as that tree grows, what may have started out as 20 tiny sprouts is now 2 or 3 main trunks that each could be a foot in diameter. And those trees, resulting trees, are a result of what's called coppice growth. And
Yes.
coppice growth also refers to, it's a silvicultural technique that was used a lot in Europe. I don't know that it's used much now.
Natural regeneration, I love that you brought natural regeneration up, that trees can regenerate too. We don't necessarily always need to plant them when they cut, because like you said, they can come up. But you also mentioned invasive species and what that means with this coppice growth, with this natural regeneration. So that I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm just about to. Let me get out of
here. Here's what I'll say about that, Agnes.
Okay,
it is true that if you're interested in, if you want to allow, say, an old field to succeed into young forest or older forest, that can be done through natural regeneration. But nowadays, what makes that challenging are 2 things. One is invasive plants, and the other is deer. And deer can really take a toll on the regenerating trees and shrubs, and it really may slow down or even prevent the area from succeeding if you live in an area that has really high deer densities.
Right.
And invasive plants, of course, I think most of our audience is familiar with invasive plants and know the challenges that those pose.
Yeah. So this is that was a good segue to this next question. What is a soft edge? You touched, you did mention the soft edge in your presentation about that successional, but do you want to quickly just remind us what a soft edge is?
Yeah, I'll try to paint a picture. I guess I didn't have a very good one in my program, but
well, I think that question came in before you had said it. So
okay, so imagine you're standing in a mature forest and you're on the edge of the forest, and as you leave the forest into the surrounding opening, if you're first passing through young trees, then smaller shrub layer, and eventually maybe tall grasses. And say that spans an area of several hundred feet or maybe hundreds of yards. That would be considered a soft edge. A hard edge, and let's imagine again, we're standing at the edge of that mature forest, looking out into the surrounding opening. Let's say that's all short mowed grass, or maybe it's all in agriculture, imagine corn or soybean. And that would be a hard edge. And there's really no edge habitat there for, say, wildlife species that need those types of edge conditions or thrive in those edge conditions.
Like the turkey needs those softer edges so they can get those bugs, but they need those bigger trees.
That's a good example. Yeah. Yep. Northern bobwhite definitely would benefit from edge habitats, as well as well-managed grasslands in the surrounding openings.
And while you were saying that, I was thinking about all the different insects that would be part of that, and how beneficial having these soft edges, this picture that you're painting, this successional image here, and all the different insects that are there for wildlife, the plants and everything. So I think I'm on an insect kick today, I think.
Yep.
So you mentioned something in your comment about the succession, bobwhite quail. So there's a question here about the status. What is the status of the bobwhite quail in Maryland?
That's a good question. It's a game species, a game bird. It's certainly not rare, threatened, or endangered, but there is a lot of concern about northern bobwhite populations, not just in Maryland, but throughout most of their range, and they are declining. I think all states to the north of Maryland, including Delaware, I think they have closed their hunting seasons. And Maryland has a more restricted season than they had years ago. I think, Agnes, you said you had Bob Long as a speaker.
You're right.
Last year, and I'm sure he talked about that. But yeah, there is a lot of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
There is a lot of concern, and DNR is trying to do management on DNR-owned lands that would benefit northern bobwhite, and working with private landowners, which are key. And like a lot of species in decline, to do effective conservation requires that one think beyond just a small tract of land, that you have to take into account the surrounding landscape. And northern bobwhite is a good example of that. They need areas on the order of hundreds or thousands of acres to really maintain viable populations. And you could say the same thing about some forest nesting birds. They too need large tracts of contiguous forest. Northern bobwhite, of course, wouldn't do well at all in a mature forested landscape. So there's that give and take. And, you know, as a DNR biologist working with my colleagues, that literally happens quite a bit. You know, we're trying to develop land management plans, recovery plans for species that might co-occur and have conflicting habitat needs. And so some hard decisions have to be made in those cases.
So if you want to catch Bob Long's presentation, you can go on the Maryland Woodland Stewardship Education website and find the Woodland Wildlife Wednesday playlist. And Bob Long from the DNR presented in September about the bobwhite quail if you want to find out more. So the question here, switching gears a little bit, what advice for turning over land for perpetuity? Any contacts? What advice do you have for people maybe who wants to do a conservation easement, or what suggestions do you have for keeping land in perpetuity?
Well, there are different land trusts in different parts of the state, but there's also a Maryland Environmental Trust, which is a statewide group. And I think that would be a good starting point to talk to them and to understand the implications, the tax benefits and cons of doing a conservation easement. But it seems to be, there's growing interest, it seems, in Maryland and elsewhere to do conservation easements.
Yes, you can find out more. I think there's some publications on our website too about what those options are. And if you do want to brainstorm some of those, I'm thinking of a document that I created relatively recently. So you feel free to contact me. So comment here, this was awesome. Thanks for presenting, Jim. I spent a lot of time in all the places you mentioned, and it was helpful to see which species are threatened. The next question, status of the timber rattlesnake in Maryland.
The timber rattlesnake has declined in both its range and probably population size. We don't believe it's at a level, though, where state listing is warranted, and likewise a federal listing. But it is a species that we think really needs attention and conservation. You know, one of the biggest things facing timber rattlesnakes these days is, I'll just lump it under the term persecution. I know it's the killing of snakes, including timber rattlesnakes, for one reason or another. I won't go into what might motivate somebody to do that. But, and so we are pretty protective about sharing data on important den sites or hibernacula for timber rattlesnakes. We don't go out of our way to advertise where rattlesnakes are, let's put it that way. Yeah,
good. That's why, is this what we learned in forestry school? When you're walking through the woods, you don't necessarily want to be the second person in line, because the first person got the rattlesnake awake and it's the second person that gets striked or something. So
there's probably some truth to that.
So this is a very interesting call to action, some advice on hearing a lot of try or strive. But what can we do to advocate for stronger laws that were coerce? I think that, again, all these big words today, landowners to remove invasive species. So how can we get involved to advocate so that there's stronger laws, so people can remove invasive species, follow good management practices, allow fire management, plant native species? Laws or penalties would help even volunteers convince uninformed landowners to allow work on their property. Any suggestions for somebody that wants to advocate?
Well, that's a really good question. it might be a good issue to bring up with forestry boards. I think all counties have a forestry board, and it's a group of individuals with forestry expertise and other expertises, but they play an important role in how timber harvesting occurs in Maryland. On state lands, we try to minimize invasive species threats as we contract with people, with loggers to do logging on state lands. So they have to abide by certain rules and certain rules. But more could be done. Certainly more could be done. We're trying to, there are examples of regulations already in place, but they're really geared towards concerns within the agricultural community. For example, some thistle species, some other invasive species like Johnson grass, farmers or landowners are required to control those species because of the impacts they could have on agriculture.
All right, I'm noticing the time. It's a few minutes before 1:30. Jim, are you okay with staying on for maybe about another 5-10 minutes?
Sure, sure.
Okay. About the advocacy, Maryland Forest Association, they do a lot of advocacy for forest landowners and forestry professionals, Maryland Forest Association. Also, if you want to contact your local politician, you know, contact your local senator that represents your area, talk to them. You know, they want to hear from you. They want to hear about these concerns. So please contact your local government. If you want help composing something or need help brainstorming something, I can help. You know, am I a pro at reaching out to legislators? Not really, but I've had some practice and I've done some things. So I'd be happy to help if you need want a cheerleader. Okay, so
Agnes, I'll just add, your audience may want to refer to the Maryland Invasive Species Council website. They've been trying to do a lot of positive things about controlling invasive plants, invasive species in general, not just plants.
So this next question, do you argue with professional foresters concerning forest interior ecology? My experience is that they don't appreciate orchids, turtles, etc.
I don't know about argue. There are some professional disagreements at times, and we try our best to work through them. In some parts of the state, like the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area, conservation for forest interior birds is required. So we have some more leverage there in those cases. And we have guidelines that we've written with the help of the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Commission staff. So there are guidelines for developers to protect forest interior habitats. And there are guidelines for folks who are interested in doing timber harvesting.
Yes. And if you're doing a timber harvest of some sort, whatever that may be for, whatever your objective is, your forester would like to work with you to make sure that your objectives are being met. If your forester is not willing to work with you to do that, then you can shop around for foresters. If you want a list of foresters, there's a list of consulting foresters on our website, and there's a list of county foresters also on the DNR website too. So please, yeah, work with your forester to let them know what your objectives are. But Jim mentioned a good point. They have regulations that they need to follow too. So here, I think as a comment, I have some land about 100 acres and I've tried to educate myself on what can be done to be a good steward. Financial help would be nice, but I've done this on my own. But I do know other landowners would bristle at the thought of being forced to do certain things. So this, I think, goes to the comment of, can you tell landowners to do things? They might even clear cut forests rather than be forced to look after it. Yes, I know it makes me angry. best to offer incentives, less stick, more carrot. So that's just a comment about what was mentioned earlier. I do want to remind everybody that clear cutting, Jim mentioned that natural regeneration. So clear cutting, there's a patch here in, I was at Wicomico County, you know, that lupin that Jim mentioned, that's endangered, and that butterfly that goes with it. They did a clear cut so that lupin could come up. So depending on what your objective is, really determines what kind of cut will happen in your forest. So really having a conversation. I love hearing you say that you're educating yourself on being a good steward. That's great, because that'll make sure that your goals for your land are being met. I love hearing that. What can be done to manage forest-dependent plant communities near populated areas where using prescribed fire is not feasible? So if you can't use fire, what could you use instead?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I go to mowing.
Well, it's hard for me to give a clear answer. There's so many caveats. What type of forest it is, how much forest is there, what's going on with invasive plants at this point. Are they well established, or is it relatively weed free? I don't know. That's a really good question. I think, you know, if you have a small forested area and you want to minimize impacts from invasive plants, the best thing you could do is to avoid soil disturbance. And that could mean putting in a forest road, not doing that, because that could be a pathway for invasive plants. You could, in some cases, create light gaps, which have some benefits for example, for wildflowers or some species that do well in forest light gaps. But you know, it's not necessary in most cases to do silviculture to provide that habitat. You know, as a forest succeeds, as it becomes older, some trees will senesce, some trees will die, and they'll create natural canopy openings. And sometimes it's those natural canopy openings that they're really much more beneficial than ones that are human-made, shall we say.
All right, I'm moving us along a little bit more quickly because I see that it's 1:35. Let's go to, what do you say we go till 1:45 and then we call it quits at that point? What do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay, so by native vegetation, what do you mean pre-European contact?
Well, that would be the ultimate. That would be the highest bar. And it's difficult to find places like that are still around in Maryland, but that would be the ideal.
All right, and we got the definition, the Maryland DNR definition is defining old growth forest. It's in the chat here. An old growth forest is a minimum of 5 acres in size, with the predominance of old trees, of which the oldest tree exceeds at least half of the projected maximum attainable age for the species, and that exhibits most of the following characteristics. And there are about 5 characteristics. I won't go on reading that definition because our time is a little valuable there, but good to know that we have the definition in the chat and that you can find that on the Maryland Department of Natural Resources website. Thank you for sharing that, Anne. I appreciate that. So there's a great...
Thank you to whoever that was. That's great information.
He writes a bit more there. That's great. Oh, look it. And then Taylor, our roadie, put in to register for the next Woodland Wildlife webinar, good plug, which is going to be Carrie. She's going to be talking about For Heaven's Snakes. Is that what it is? All about snakes. Oh, for goodness snakes. For goodness snakes. That's next. There's the link. There's the link for that one. So to register for any upcoming ones. Okay, so we got a question here, Jim. How about the whippoorwills? I don't know if I've ever really seen it spelt out, or maybe I'm hungry.
Was there a specific question about whippoorwills?
What about them? That was the specific question. What about whippoorwills? So I'm wondering if they're questioning the status of that,
Oh, I
or
see. Okay. Whippoorwills are a species of greatest conservation need here in Maryland and in most other states in the surrounding region. And that means that they are eligible to do conservation work for that species. They're eligible for state agencies can use state wildlife grant monies. That's what that designation really means when it gets right down to it. But it also identifies this broad suite of species that includes not only endangered species, but species that are declining. They may still be common, but they are of concern. The whippoorwill is a forest nesting bird. It is considered area sensitive, so it needs large contiguous forests and particularly needs forested landscapes. It doesn't require old growth forest, but it does need heavily forested landscapes. And one of the best places in Maryland to see, or more likely hear, a whippoorwill would be in Allegheny County in Green Ridge State Forest. And there are also some good places on the lower Eastern Shore, Pocomoke State Forest, Chesapeake Forest lands.
great, great. So Mark here wrote a lot about invasive plants, and deer have been a challenge for him. I won't read his whole thing. They inherited the land and they started putting some trees in there. And he was saying, I did want to say that letting a forest regenerate will only work as if there's a natural equilibrium is present. Otherwise, you'll see a lot of tree of heaven barberry. Right. So natural regeneration needs our help because those invasive species were brought in. You know, how did they get in there? Right. So interesting points, invasive species. And that is a segue to the next question, which is, what is your recommendation for landowners with extensive invasive species on their property?
Wow. That's a great question. There's some places, and I can think of many, that it almost seems futile that invasive plants are so abundant. And you might just want to pick off a piece of the property. It could just be an acre, and focus on it and try to do what you can. I can appreciate there are some areas in Maryland it's very, very challenging.
So yeah, it depends on what your objectives are. That's where I go with invasive species. Integrated pest vegetation management. You can go from manual control, pulling it out yourself and continuing to go over and remove it manually. You could use some product on that, glyphosate or other products that are good for that. We're actually going to be doing on March 16th and 18th through our Natural Areas Management Services webinar series. We're actually talking about vegetation management that week. So if you're interested in that, that's going to be it's a 4-part, actually eight webinar series. But that's the final week is vegetation management. So very good question. And that in itself, we're taking at least just about 3 hours on that topic alone in March. So if you want to find out more, contact me. I can hook you up with getting registered for that program. Somebody put some interesting links there, marylandflora.org, and getting involved in the Maryland Native Plant Society. If you're on Facebook, you can find some groups on Facebook that are about Maryland native plants. There was a lot of congratulations and thank yous for doing the presenting. A question here, why are these extreme restorations? Okay, so Jim's opinion on new stream restoration program that clears areas that replants. Why are these extreme restorations being approved? Loss of forest. I guess that's not for us to answer because we're not approving those extreme restoration programs. That's a good question for the Maryland Department of Environment And, you know, I think a lot of those places also take in, they have comment periods where you can also comment on. So somebody said, I have lots of mile a minute, Japanese stiltgrass. If I pull it up, will it disturb the soil? What should I do? Good fight. You're doing a good. And just a reminder that Jim McCann is not an invasive species removal expert. He is a
Thank you so much,
threatened
Agnes.
endangered species
Yep.
expert. So we
I'll just give you some examples that I've done on the property that I live on. I live in, again, Garrett County, and I have some forest, and I've been living there for over 15 years. And when I first moved in, garlic mustard had really invaded much of the forest. And so did Japanese stiltgrass. And so I told my kids, who were much younger then, I said, hey, for every plant you pull, I'll give you a penny. And every year we would get out there and pull hundreds, if not thousands of plants they'd pitch in. And I can say 15 years later, it's made a huge impact. The native plant diversity in the forest floor around my home is much greater. Native plants are much more abundant. So, you know, things like that can work on a small scale.
So it's not necessarily disturbing the soil, but it may be disturbing in a way that the other seeds are having, the other, you know, dormant seeds in the soil are having a way up.
Right.
Oh, there's a link for our webinar series that I mentioned that has the forest herbicide that, you know, I mentioned in March 16th and 18th, our vegetation management week. There's a link in there from Jonathan Kays, my colleague, to register for that. That's going to be a good one. It's anyway, I won't talk about it because we're not here to advertise it, but so somebody found mile a minute is shallow rooted, and they found that ripping it up was great. And somebody said that Japanese stiltgrass pulls up easy, usually doesn't disturb the soil that much. So some people are giving some advice. I love these chats. I love these chats because we can share our opinions, our experiences, and I wish we had more time for those. And maybe we need to dedicate just one thing to exchange ideas, one episode to exchange ideas. But I think that's it for our questions, Jim.
Okay.
I think there was some congratulations and thank yous, and unless somebody has one last comment to put in there. But that looks like it. Jim, I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Hey, you know, this is great. I learned a lot, and I appreciate y'all. Oh, I did have one of my own questions. Do you guys ever take any volunteers?
Yes, we do. Yep. And we have one staff member who spends a lot of her time coordinating volunteers. We rely on volunteers for a lot of the work that we do.
So if I were to be looking for a volunteer option to help out with some of these threatened and endangered species, I would be able to call that office number that you have on the screen there. And will that lead me to the volunteer coordinator?
No, but if you go on Maryland DNR's website and go to the Natural Heritage Program link, there should be, I'm pretty sure there's a contact number there, not necessarily for quote unquote volunteers, but just call that number and they'll put you in touch with the right person.
Okay, so I'm going to Google Maryland Natural Heritage, and I'm going to see on there a phone number and call them and ask them about volunteering. It's a great opportunity to get out there, not only get to know your state a little bit more, but help out with biodiversity in your state. That's great. Okay, Jim.
Well, thank you, Agnes.
Thanks for taking the time with us. Oh, and our time it's 1:45, so that's what I was hoping for.
Perfect.
So I appreciate it. I look forward to getting the update on the work that you guys are doing with getting some other species listed. So keep us in touch with that. That'd be nice to get updated on that. We're all probably pretty curious about it.
Be glad to.
Thanks, Jim. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next month for goodness snakes. Take care. Thank you. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.